some of the conscripts on the borders didn't even have guns, and they were fighting against people with NATO-class equipment and seasoned military professionals. So it was obviously a state of total chaos. So the Russians have got three choices now. They either withdraw forces from Kherson and Zaporizhia, which is what they've been doing, according to some Ukrainian military sources last week, because they don't believe the Ukrainians can cross the river in Dnipro and take over that other bank of Kherson very easily. The fortifications in Zaporizhia are so strong that even a drawdown of manpower will still make it very hard for the Ukrainians to cut through all those mines and trenches, as we saw last summer. That's probably what they're doing right now. They're sending Rosgvardia into the mix also to try to strengthen and shore up and stymie the Ukrainian advance. And they're sending more conscripts onto the front lines. But that doesn't seem to be enough to stop Ukraine's advances, because Ukraine, even after some of those things were done, was able to take over Sudzha and was able to destroy the bridges and move further.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and the incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Samuel Ramani, an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and the author of Russia in Africa and Putin's War on Ukraine. He's also a respected geopolitical analyst and commentator, and he joins us now. Samuel Ramani, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Here we are 2 weeks into Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. What is your assessment of how it's going at the moment?
Well, it's certainly going a lot better than almost anybody would have expected from the Ukrainian side. I think the Ukrainians were confident that Russia had porous and vulnerable borders on its western flank because of the ease in which partisans from the Russian Volunteer Corps in May of 2023 were able to cross those borders, the ease by which similar kinds of partisans were able to cross into Belgorod and Kursk earlier this year, and perhaps most dramatically, how rapid Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group forces were able to take over the military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don and march to within 200 miles of Moscow. But obviously, the fact that the Ukrainians have a military administration being set up in Kursk less than 2 weeks into their offensive is something that I think nobody could have anticipated.
It's a really good point you raise about Prigozhin, because it simultaneously feels quite recent, but also feels a long time ago in that weird way that the time plays that trick on us. And I suppose what it reminds us of is there was so much conversation in the wake of the Prigozhin mutiny of the vulnerability of Putin's position. But so far this year, because Russia's been on the front foot in the east of Ukraine and has been making incremental gains, a lot of that conversation had died down until now. But now we're being reminded of some of the fundamental weaknesses of Putin's position.
Exactly. I think that Putin's position never really durably strengthened, I think, after the takeover of Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed mutiny. I think that what happened was Putin's Russia decided to use repression against Russian ultranationalists, which is not a tactic that it had used in the past. Ultranationalist forces throughout Russian history have historically been a thorn on the side of the ruling elites. During the First World War, it was the Russian ultranationalist forces who resisted any kind of compromise with Germany, who wanted more of a total war, who believed the Tsar Nicholas II was not really fighting the war more strongly enough. They carried out the 1993 constitutional crisis against Boris Yeltsin. They even, from some members of the Bolshevik Party, even occupied buildings in the early 2000s. So, but Putin opted in the mid-2000s to co-opt those groups, to bring in and empower figures like Ramzan Kadyrov, Patriarch Kirill from the Orthodox Church, Yevgeny Prigozhin, Sergei Glaziev as economic advisor, and Dmitry Rogozin from as ambassador to NATO. And but by the time the Ukraine war came around, their criticisms became so sharp that they were discrediting and undermining his authority and that of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian military. And after the mutiny, he chose to repress them. That's why he arrested Gurkin. That's why Prigozhin got assassinated. That's why Surovikin got dismissed. That's why a whole host of these developments took place. But that unrest is not going to go away. I mean, there was actually sizable numbers of criticisms on Russian Telegram of the slow pace of Russia's war effort, warnings about the lack of fortifications and defense on Russia's borders, even before what we saw in Kursk. And now that mistrust in the military and the political establishment is starting to resurface and bubble up again. Because 150 years of history of Russian ultranationalists being a thorn on the side in the Kremlin is not going to go away just because you shoot down Prigozhin's plan.
I mean, that's a really good point. I want to come on to some of the specifics about the incursion in a moment. But just from the kind of the Kremlinology side of it, I mean, What do you think the conversation would have been like a couple of weeks ago when presumably one of Putin's military advisors approached President Putin, told him, by the way, Ukraine have crossed the border into the Kursk region, that they're managing to hold some territory? What would have been going through his head when he heard that?
Well, exactly. That's what we've been seeing from some of the latest reporting that these discussions were happening about 2 weeks before the Kursk incursion began. The very idea that the Ukrainians could take substantial amounts of Russian territory and hold it for a period of time. But I think that there was collective skepticism and disbelief within the Russian Ministry of Defense and within the FSB, and also the old tendency recirculating again. Nobody in the FSB, nobody in the Ministry of Defense wants to be the person to be the bearer of bad news to Putin, because if you bear bad news to the Russian news czar, it doesn't really end very well for you. So I think that historical dishonesty within the system is something that's really come to the fore right now. It's undermined Russia's preparations, and it's really exposed the Russian Ministry of Defense to be inept and incompetent. The very fact that Valery Gerasimov, just 2 days into the incursion, said that it was not only contained, but the 300 Ukrainian forces that had entered Kursk were dead, I think is a sign that nobody really believes or has any trust, if they had anything left at all, in what's coming from the messaging from the Russian military. And the problem is it doesn't allow Putin and it doesn't allow his inner circle to respond effectively to changes on the ground.
I mean, this is always the danger of leading an autocratic regime. You know, when you use propaganda as a tool, you start to wonder at what point does the leader believe their own propaganda? At what point do they become high on their own supply? And do you think that's the situation Putin is in at the moment?
Well, I think that's been the situation that Putin's been in even before this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think that basically they bought into the notion that about 25 or 30% of Ukrainians before the war were going to, because they were ethnic Russian, because they spoke Russian, were going to be greeting the Russians as liberators, so that the Russians would have no problem taking over large swathes of Kherson, Zaporizhia, as well as the remainders of Donetsk and Luhansk, and possibly even push for Kharkiv and Odessa. And Putin is in a circle believed that, even though in 2014 they realized that when the Russian deniable forces went into Donetsk, ethnic Russians in Ukraine, Russian speakers in Ukraine, took up arms and fought for the Ukrainian army. But they didn't necessarily remember that experience 8 years later, because the propaganda was so intense that they believed that these people were going to rise up. And that's been the chronic mistake and the chronic blind spot that the Kremlin has had pretty much ever since then. I don't think the Russians really believe that the Ukrainians were able to launch an effective offensive operation. That's why when the Ukrainians started launching a counteroffensive in the summer of 2022 in Kherson and Kharkiv, they basically in the early days said that it was going to be failing, it was going to be rebuffed. There was no way they were going to be able to achieve success. And then the Ukrainians achieved landmark successes. And the failure of the summer 2023 counteroffensive for Ukraine, I think, just reinforced this sense of inflated overconfidence. And that's what we saw happening in Kursk. There was really no way in which I think Putin or any of his inner circle really believed that the Ukrainians could actually act on what they were saying. The Ukrainians have been saying that they want to bring the war to Russia, to make the Russians feel the consequence of what they're doing to Ukrainian civilians every day. I don't think that Putin and his inner circle ever believed that the Ukrainians would be able to do that.
What do you think explains, Samuel, the slowness of the Russian response? Because if you're going to launch an effective counterattack, it helps if you launch that counterattack quickly. But here we are 2 weeks on, and there's no particular sign of Russia pushing back against the territory that's been taken by Ukraine.
Well, because I think that there's a lot of issues associated with how Russia can actually respond to this quite effectively. The Ukrainians are coming in not with a bunch of untrained forces, but with some of their seasoned commanders. Some of the commanders who are fighting in Kursk are people who were fighting for territorial defense battalions as early as 2014. So they have a lot of experience on the ground. They have NATO class infrastructure along with them. They have HIMARS systems that can destroy, as we've seen now, 3 bridges in the Kursk region. So this is not an inexperienced bunch, and it looks as if the Russians were claiming that 300 Ukrainians enter. It probably was closer to 2,000, and it could be as much as 15,000 that the Ukrainians may be able to hold in that area. So the Ukrainians have come with a large number of troops, and they cannot really be dislodged easily. So this leaves Russia with a quandary as to how it can respond, because the only people that it had on its borders were untrained conscripts who were easily overrun. Some of the conscripts on the borders didn't even have guns, and they were fighting against people with NATO-class equipment and seasoned military professionals. So it was obviously a state of total chaos. So the Russians have got three choices now. They either withdraw forces from Kherson and Zaporizhia, which is what they've been doing, according to some Ukrainian military sources last week, because they don't believe the Ukrainians can cross the river in Dnipro and take over that other bank of Kherson very easily. The fortifications in Zaporizhia are so strong that even a drawdown of manpower will still make it very hard for the Ukrainians to cut through all those mines and trenches, as we saw last summer. That's probably what they're doing right now. They're sending Rosgvardia into the mix also to try to strengthen and shore up and stymie the Ukrainian advance. And they're sending more conscripts onto the front lines. But that doesn't seem to be enough to stop Ukraine's advances, because Ukraine, even after some of those things were done, was able to take over Sudzha and was able to destroy the bridges and move further. So now the Russians face an even more uncomfortable quandary. They have to withdraw some forces from Donetsk, where they're right on the cusp of achieving a success in Pekrovsk, and they're right on the cusp of achieving a success in Chasiv Yar, which could allow them to push into the Donetsk major cities finally after all that sacrifice in Bakhmut. They have to they have to blow their advantage there and defend their homeland, or they have to call some effectively a much larger mobilization, effectively something resembling a general mobilization. But to even give those new conscripts a minimal amount of training, it means that Ukrainian forces are probably going to be stuck in Russia for at least a month or two.
Yeah, and of course, a big mobilization push carries with it political risks as well. I mean, of those options, Samuel, which do you think is the most likely we'll see from Russia?
Well, I think that the Russians are actually picking none of the above, and they're taking a very high risk strategy. They're hoping that they can make some much faster than expected gains in Donetsk after Pokrovsk falls, and then force the Ukrainians to go back and withdraw the troops from Kursk and defend their homeland. It's true that the Russians are making incremental gains in the Pokrovsk area, and there have been evacuations now. The Ukrainians are saying they have to leave within 2 weeks in a town of 53,000 people. It's possible that that area will fall, and Russia will get a significant logistical advantage. But Russia does not have a history, aside from Mariupol, of taking over large cities inside Ukraine with any degree of pace. So moving on to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk is going to be a long slog. I think the Russians believe that they can carry out some kind of a surprise blitz in Donetsk and force the Ukrainians to withdraw, and that's their strategy right now. But I don't think that that's necessarily that feasible. So I think the Russians will have to go back to those two very unpalatable choices: surrender your momentum in eastern Ukraine, or start mobilizing a lot more people.
Sounds like you're saying the Russians are still in denial.
I think the Russians are still in denial. They're still scrambling on how to adjust, and they're still also scrambling on how to adjust in a way that promotes a sense of normalcy at home, especially after the initial propaganda was that this is nothing much to worry about. So the Russian telegram channels, when they first said there was nothing much to worry about, were kind of being a bit guarded, but critical in their own way. They were like saying the Russians have finally sent Rosgvardia and regular forces. How many times do you use the word finally in one paragraph to make that point, right? That was, I think, Oleg Saryev who made that kind of post. And others were kind of saying the situation was very grave. That was like their way of criticizing it. I think that if the situation lasts longer, being in denial and trying to promote a mood of normalcy is not going to satisfy the clued in ultranationalist bloggers who populate the Telegram space.
You mentioned the bridges a moment ago, Samuel. I wanted to ask you about that because Ukraine has now destroyed the third and final bridge linking
Right.
the occupied part of the Kursk region to the rest of the oblast. How significant is that? And I mean, you've got Russia saying, playing it down almost, saying, look, we've been able to establish pontoons, so it doesn't really matter. Again, is that Russia being in denial? Or how would you evaluate the significance of dropping those bridges?
Well, I think it's very significant. I think it's also, again, the risk of Russia being in denial, because how many times did the Russians talk about their pontoon ferries and their temporary crossings in Kherson in the months leading up to the collapse of Kherson in November of 2022, right? From August to November 2022, that was exactly what they were talking about. All these kind of pontoons and ferries and alternative supply routes to replace the bridges. But once the Ukrainians got the Antonovsky Bridge, there was not much the Russians could do. So I think that this is looking like a repeat of the military failures that we saw in Kherson with regards to the bridges, and the initial Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is looking a lot like the undermanned positions in Kharkiv that had to flee in September of 2022. So this setback in Kursk is reminding the Russians, even if they don't want to admit it, of their two most humiliating defeats of this war: that withdrawal from Kherson and that withdrawal from Kharkiv.
Wanted to get your thoughts as well, Samuel, on a conversation we were having on yesterday's episode of Frontline with the former British Army Colonel, now military analyst Hamish de Bretton Gordon. And he was saying he thinks it's feasible that we will see Ukraine launch further cross border attacks into Russia in the coming weeks and months, given the success of the Kursk incursion. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's very possible. I think that there was some reporting yesterday, and the Economist picked up on it, that Kursk was not the only region where the Ukrainians thought that they could make an advance. The Ukrainians were also looking quite seriously at Bryansk. And Bryansk was an area where they were shelling even in middle of 2022. And that was one of the first regions, actually, of Russia where the Ukrainians actually struck and tried to bring the war to the Russians, right? So there's a possibility that they could do something in Bryansk. There's a possibility that they could do something in Belgorod. I have a feeling that the Russians were most prepared for the Belgorod scenario, which is why there have been so many evacuations and sealing off of territory as unsafe. They figured that Belgorod would be the natural antidote to striking Kharkiv, whereas Kursk would be the natural antidote to striking Sumy. They'd done more damage to Kharkiv, so they expected more from Belgorod. But I think so. I think that if the Ukrainians go somewhere else, they will trick the Russians again and hit Bryansk rather than hit Belgorod again.
Of course, we don't know at this stage what Ukraine's primary objective with the Kursk incursion is, so we can only speculate, I suppose. Originally, I thought, well, it's designed to divert troops away from the front line in the east of Ukraine into Kursk region, regain the initiative. Increasingly, and I don't know whether you agree with this, Samuel, my sense is maybe this actually was designed as a message to the West to say, look, if we take the fight to Russia, A, we can win, and B, your fears of some kind of retaliation, some drastic retaliation, potentially using tactical nuclear weapons by Putin, those fears are unfounded. What is your sense of things?
I think I absolutely agree with what you're just saying right now. I think that the Western perception was very much that Ukraine was going to try to drain out Russia's manpower. And it's true that the Russians may have to divert manpower from Donetsk over there. But as I've just been saying, that's the option that they're going to have to go if, as an undesirable, maybe lesser evil choice or greater conscription. And it's not something that's going to happen immediately, as we're seeing, right? So it's only it's something that could happen, but it's not something that will happen immediately. I think that the Ukrainians are aware that the Russians have a lot of cannon fodder that they can throw on the front lines still. So what they're trying to do is trying to convince the West that the fight is worth supporting after the failed counteroffensive last summer and the slowdown in congressional aid that we saw in the first half of this year. They really want to show, regardless of who gets into the White House in November, whether it be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, especially I think Trump, that this is a war that's worth fighting and continuing to support. They want to strengthen their position in future negotiations. Whether that be a temporary Kursk for Kharkiv land swap, or whether that be occupying more Russian territory and pushing for something more substantive in a final settlement negotiation. I think that's also something that they're trying to do. And more importantly, they're trying to blow this idea of escalation risks with Russia and trying to get people to stop thinking about this because Russia really can't escalate that much more than they're already doing. I think that's what the Ukrainians want to send a message to. They can kill more Ukrainian civilians, but they're unlikely to use nuclear weapons. And that's why the Germans should move ahead with the Taurus cruise missiles. The Americans should send more cruise missiles. The Americans should give permission for long range strikes all across Russia, not just across the borders. And the British should really come up with a more firm and consistent policy on the storm shadows. So I think that that's what the Ukrainians want in the short term.
Do you see any sign of that, though, Samuel? Do you see any sign of Ukraine's Western allies moving on those restrictions?
Well, I think that there will be signs. I think as the offensive goes on, I think it's a little bit too early to say. I think Keir Starmer certainly has basically alluded to the fact that the storm shadows can be used more extensively, and I think that could be a step. And really, as we noted, all it takes is one major ally to make a big decision, and the others usually tend to fall in line, right? So when France and the Dutch and some others broke the taboo on striking Russia, period, we even saw Olaf Scholz, known for his caution, go along with the use of German weapons, and German weapons have been used in this Kursk offensive, and there hasn't been any criticism from Germany about that. When the Germans were holding their back on the tanks, the Americans promised the Abrams, and look what happened. The Leopards came, right? So all it takes is one or two allies to set the trend and to move all the others in line, and I suspect that we will see more than one or two allies doing that in the weeks to come.
There's also been a lot of talk about Ukraine potentially wanting to use some of the Russian prisoners of war it's captured in exchange for the release of about 8,000 odd Ukrainian soldiers held by Russia. Do you think Putin would accept that?
I think that prisoner exchanges have been one of the most enduring features, probably the only enduring, consistent aspect of diplomacy throughout this entire war. And we've seen them even enduring very dark moments, like when the Black Sea grain deal was being torpedoed, during the worst and darkest periods of the Bakhmut offensive, after the destruction of the Novokhovka Dam. Many, many hard moments in the war were followed not so long after by prisoner exchanges. And I think that that's something that will be ongoing. I think that that's something the Ukrainians can actually hope to achieve more of. I think that by taking more Russian POWs, they'll be able to get more of their own people back.
How much does the impression that ordinary Russians are getting of this incursion matter? I mean, obviously, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who've now been evacuated from their homes in the Kursk Oblast and Belgorod as well. So they'll clearly be noticing what Ukraine are doing. But is it feeding back to other ordinary Russians across the country? And does that matter?
Well, I think it is starting to hit home to some degree because any Russian who is even somewhat clued in on Telegram is pretty clear that what they're hearing from their government is not exactly what's actually happening. Even if they don't know all the details, they know the situation is much more serious than what it looks like. And what we're seeing right now, obviously, is Russian State, Russia One, Ria Novosti, kind of going in overdrive and basically talking about how there's some kind of a rift between the Westerns and the governments and the Ukrainians over this. On the one hand, like the Ukrainians are going too far and they're going to lose support. On the other hand, they're saying that this is a terror attack that really was originated in the decision making centers in London or the decision making centers in Washington. They can't really even seem to get their story straight on whether the Ukrainians are good, obedient proxies or whether the Ukrainians are kind of rogue neo Nazi criminals who the West are as offended by as they are. So, as long as their state media puts out this firehouse of falsehoods that really don't make any sense to anybody, and people have access to Telegram, they don't have access to Signal very much anymore because the Russians are cracking down on that. But and encrypted communication, encrypted photos are being cracked down on. But as long as they have access to Telegram, as long as they're seeing what's the chaos that's going on in their information space, they can probably put two and two together and realize that this is something that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and again, that's a really good point because, again, this is a chance for Ukraine to win the information war in terms of the way Ukrainian troops behave in Russia in comparison to the way Russian troops have been behaving in Ukraine. There was a fascinating piece in the Sunday Times over the weekend where one of our journalists had been speaking to some of the Russian prisoners who had been captured, some of the conscripts. They were being held in a detention center in Sumy. And they were saying, look, we were terrified when we came here because we'd heard all these stories, all this propaganda about being tortured by the Ukrainians. Actually, we've been treated very well. We've had great medical treatment. Some of the guards have spent their own money buying us cigarettes and water and pastries. And so that provides an opportunity for Ukraine to further win the information war.
Exactly. I think that is something that can be done quite readily. I think the fact that the Ukrainian incursions in Kursk, the Russians keep talking about how it's an act of terrorism against residential areas, how the bridges were killing volunteers or helping people evacuate. They're trying to push the narrative that the Ukrainians are absolutely brutal and are indiscriminate in the massacre of civilians there. It does not seem as if the Ukrainian attacks on Kursk are inflicting anywhere near the kind of civilian damage and the kind of harm that the Russian attacks on so many major cities are doing. So the Ukrainians can occupy territory without massacring civilians and without destroying almost every building in their sight. They can get some kind of a clear moral high ground over Russia that maybe even the Russians, with all the propaganda that's fitting them, might be able to see through and accept.
Just finally, Samuel, if you're Vladimir Putin, what's the worst case scenario from here? What else could go wrong for him in the coming weeks?
Well, I think the worst case scenario would probably be the Ukrainians manage to expand from Kursk and launch additional axes, just like what Hamish was talking about, just like what we were just discussing earlier. I think that that would be a real quandary for the Russian military campaign. It might force them to move towards the obviously the prospect of greater and more enhanced mobilization, which is something that he's been resisting and he hasn't wanted to do. I think that also as Putin gets more and more desperate, we have to play a very close eye on what's happening with the nuclear power plants because the Russian Foreign Ministry has already said that the Kursk nuclear power plant and Zaporizhia nuclear power plant are under attack by Ukrainian forces. And there have been reports, obviously, of some fires in the Zaporizhia plant. It's unclear obviously the data separation plant has been partially disabled. It's unclear whether they have the fuel there that would be necessary to cause a nuclear meltdown or not. But electricity needs to keep flowing into that plant for it to work, for it to ever work again, and for it to stay cool. So cutting one of those electrical wires could be enough. So there's obviously a lot of things that Putin has to worry about. And I think that we should be worried about Putin getting more and more desperate right now, and maybe doing something with the nuclear plants. I don't think his desperation will rise to the level though that we will see a nuclear strike.
Dr. Samuel Ramani, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.